I should have known something was wrong the moment the realtor avoided eye contact when I asked about the basement. 3 families had lived in this house over the past decade, and all of them had left suddenly, without explanation. But I was desperate for a fresh start in Salem, Oregon, and the Victorian house was priced too good to pass up. I had no idea that something ancient and hungry had been waiting in the darkness below, and that my arrival was exactly what it had been hoping for. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar, because what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about what exists in the shadows of our everyday world. My name is David, and until 6 months ago, I was a rational man. I worked in software development, believed in logic and reason, and thought ghost stories were entertainment for people who needed excitement in their mundane lives. I was wrong about everything. The move to Salem was supposed to be my new beginning. After a brutal divorce that left me emotionally and financially drained, I needed somewhere cheap to rebuild my life. The 1890s Victorian on Chemichetta Street was perfect. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, and a basement that could serve as my home office. The price was so low I didn't question why. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly realtor, seemed nervous during the walkthrough. She rushed through the main floors, highlighting the beautiful crown molding and restored windows. But when we reached the basement door, she hesitated. "The basement is functional," she said, her hand trembling slightly on the doorknob. "Previous owners used it for storage mostly. The electrical was updated in 2019. She opened the door and immediately stepped back, gesturing for me to go first. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the cool, musty air below. The basement was larger than I expected, with stone foundation walls that looked original to the house. A single bare bulb hung from the center of the ceiling, casting harsh shadows into the corners. Plenty of space. I called up to Mrs. Henderson, but she didn't respond. When I climbed back upstairs, I found her standing by the front door, clearly ready to leave. "Any questions about the basement?" I asked. "No," she replied quickly. "Like I said, it's functional. The inspection report is clean. No foundation issues, no water damage. Hit the like button if this story is already giving you an uneasy feeling, because it only gets worse from here." I signed the papers that afternoon and moved in 2 weeks later. The first few nights were blissfully normal. I unpacked boxes, set up my computer in the living room temporarily, and began to feel hopeful about my fresh start. The house had character, old floorboards that sang under my feet, windows that let in gorgeous morning light, and the kind of solid construction you don't find in modern homes. It was on my 4th night that I first heard the scratching. I was lying in the master bedroom, nearly asleep, when a rhythmic scraping sound drifted up from below. Scratch, 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 like fingernails dragging across stone. I sat up, listening carefully. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Old houses make noise, I told myself. Pipes expanding and contracting, wood settling, maybe mice in the walls. I'd grown up in a 1960s ranch house where every temperature change announced itself with creaks and pops. This was just part of living in a building that had seen over a century of seasons. The scratching returned the next night, and the night after that. Always the same rhythm, always from the basement, always stopping abruptly when I paid too much attention to it. After a week, I realized I was subconsciously timing my sleep around it. The scratching would start around 11:30 p.m. and continue intermittently until about 3 a.m. Probably mice, I told myself, and bought a handful of traps. I set the traps in the basement one evening, baiting them with peanut butter and placing them in corners where mice would likely travel. The basement felt different that night as I worked, colder than usual, and I kept having the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. Several times I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but found only shadows. The next morning, I checked the traps. Every single one had been triggered, but there were no mice. The peanut butter was gone, the traps were snapped, but whatever had taken the bait wasn't any rodent I'd ever encountered. Stranger still, the traps hadn't just been triggered. They'd been arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the basement floor. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because even now, I'm not sure I understand it completely. I reset the traps, this time adding a cheap motion-activated camera I'd bought for home security. If something was getting into my basement, I wanted to know what it was. The camera had night vision and would record any movement, storing the footage on a small SD card. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It seemed to come from multiple locations at once: the walls, the floor, even the ceiling above my head. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should go downstairs and investigate, but something deep in my primitive brain was screaming at me to stay exactly where I was, covers pulled up to my chin like a frightened child. The scratching stopped at 3:17 a.m. I know this because I was watching the clock, counting the minutes until morning. The next day, I rushed to check the camera footage. My heart was pounding as I popped the SD card into my laptop and opened the video file. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The basement was empty in the footage. No mice, no intruders, nothing moving at all. But the traps were being triggered anyway. One by one, I watched them snap shut, the metal bars slamming down on empty air. Then, impossibly, they began to slide across the concrete floor, moving on their own, until they formed that same perfect circle I'd found the morning before. But that wasn't the worst part. In the final seconds of the footage just before the recording stopped, a shadow passed directly in front of the camera. Not the shadow of an object blocking the light. This was a shadow with no source, a patch of darkness that moved independently through the basement like it was alive. I watched that section of footage 50 times, frame by frame, trying to find a logical explanation. There was none. Something was in my basement, something that existed but didn't register as a physical presence on camera, and it was intelligent enough to manipulate objects in deliberate patterns. Subscribe if you want to hear more terrifying true stories like this one, because what happened next pushed me to the absolute limits of sanity. I decided to confront whatever was down there. I know it sounds stupid now, but at the time, I was still clinging to rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon, or air currents from a hidden opening I hadn't noticed. I equipped myself with a powerful flashlight, my phone to record video, and a digital thermometer I'd read that ghosts caused temperature drops. The basement felt different the moment I reached the bottom of the stairs. The air was thicker somehow, like breathing through wet cloth, and my flashlight beam seemed dimmer than it should have been. The temperature reading on my thermometer was 43 degrees, nearly 30 degrees colder than the rest of the house. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. "Is someone down here?" The silence that followed was oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm when all the birds stopped singing. Then, from the far corner of the basement, came a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. A voice, soft whispering, speaking words in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood in my bones. The voice was old, not elderly but ancient, like it had been speaking those words since before human civilization began. And it was saying my name. "David," it whispered in that impossible language. "David, you came back to us." I spun toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the stone wall and a pile of old boxes the previous owners had left behind. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The response came from directly behind me. "We have been waiting," the voice said, and I could feel breath on the back of my neck. "So long we have been waiting for you to come home." I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I dropped my flashlight, forgot about recording evidence, and ran up those basement stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I slammed the basement door behind me and stood in my kitchen, heart hammering, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my mind was working overtime, trying to find explanations. Auditory hallucinations brought on by stress from the divorce, carbon monoxide poisoning from an old furnace, a neighbor playing an elaborate prank with hidden speakers. But deep down, in the part of my brain that remembered what it was like to be prey, I knew the truth. Something was living in my basement, something that knew my name and had been waiting for me specifically. Let me know if you've ever felt that primal terror of knowing you're not alone. because over the next few weeks, that feeling became my constant companion. I tried to ignore it. I stayed out of the basement, kept the door locked, and tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole encounter. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. I avoided going to bed until I was exhausted enough to fall asleep immediately, hoping to skip past the nightly scratching sounds. But the entity, and I now knew that's what it was, wasn't content to stay in the basement. It started small. Items in my house would be moved slightly when I wasn't looking. I'd set my coffee mug on the kitchen counter and find it in the sink an hour later. Books would fall off shelves for no reason. My computer would turn itself on in the middle of the night, the screen glowing in my peripheral vision as I tried to sleep. Then the whispers began upstairs. At first, I could only hear them when the house was completely quiet. Soft murmuring that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The same ancient language I'd heard in the basement, but now the words carried an urgency that made my skin crawl. It was like listening to someone having an animated conversation in the next room, except there was no next room in that direction, just the exterior wall. The whispers grew louder over the course of a week. Soon I could hear them during the day, a constant background murmur that made it impossible to concentrate on work. I started wearing headphones constantly, blasting music to drown out the sounds, but somehow the whispers cut through everything. They were inside my head now, speaking directly into my consciousness. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section, because I need to know I'm not the only one who's faced something like this. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late October. I was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep because of the whispers, when I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing up from below. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps reached the basement door. The handle turned. I could hear the old brass mechanism creaking, and the door opened. The footsteps continued into my kitchen. But here's the thing. I could hear where the footsteps were, but I couldn't see anything moving. My bedroom was directly above the kitchen, and through the old floorboards, I could track the entity's movement through my house. It walked to the refrigerator, stood there for several minutes, then moved to the sink. I heard the faucet turn on and water begin to flow. This was no longer something confined to the basement. Whatever lived down there was now moving freely through my home, and it was getting bolder. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet. Not that I thought it would be effective against a supernatural entity, but holding a weapon made me feel slightly less helpless. I crept to my bedroom door and listened. The footsteps were in my living room now, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. The sound was accompanied by that whispering voice, but now it was speaking English, and what it was saying made my blood freeze. "David is home," it said in a voice like rustling leaves. "David came back to us just like we knew he would. David belongs here, in the deep places, in the dark places, in the cold places below." I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple entities down there, and they were talking about me like I was an expected guest who had finally arrived for a long-planned reunion. "He remembers us," said a second voice, this one deeper, like stones grinding together. "In his bones he remembers, in his blood he knows. He is of the old line, the deep line, the line that goes down into the earth." Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because what I discovered about my connection to this house changed everything I thought I knew about my own identity. The voices continued their conversation as if I wasn't listening from upstairs. They spoke about bloodlines and ancient pacts, about families who had lived in this house before, and the obligations that passed from generation to generation. They mentioned names I didn't recognize but that somehow felt familiar. Abner Blackwood, Mordecai Thorne, Ezekiel Cross. Then they said something that stopped my heart completely. "The Hartwell line returns," whispered a third voice, thin and reedy like wind through a graveyard. "Young David Hartwell comes home to honor the old agreements. The basement calls to him, as it called to his great-grandfather, as it called to his great-great-grandfather before that. My last name is Hartwell. My family had lived in Oregon for generations, But I'd never researched our genealogy beyond my grandparents. Now these entities were telling me that my family had a connection to this house that went back over a century. The footsteps moved to the base of my staircase. I heard the first creak of the old wooden steps as something began to climb toward my bedroom. I didn't wait to see what was coming up those stairs. I grabbed my car keys, wallet, and phone, threw on the first clothes I could find, and climbed out my bedroom window onto the roof of the front porch. From there, I dropped to the ground and ran to my car, not caring that I was barefoot and wearing only pajama pants and a t-shirt in the October cold. I drove to the nearest 24-hour diner and sat in a corner booth until sunrise, nursing cup after cup of coffee and trying to process what had happened. The waitress kept giving me concerned looks, probably wondering why a grown man was shivering in his pajamas at 3 a.m., but I couldn't bring myself to care about appearances. When morning came, I drove to the Salem Public Library as soon as it opened. If the entities were telling the truth about my family's connection to the house, there would be records. Property deeds, census data, newspaper articles, something that would explain why these things knew my name and considered me part of some ancient agreement I'd never heard of. Comment below what you think I discovered about my family's history, because the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. What I found in the historical records section made me understand why the house had been priced so low, and why every family who'd lived there recently had left so suddenly. The house had been built in 1890 by Josiah Hartwell, my great-great-grandfather. According to the records, Josiah was a wealthy merchant who'd made his fortune in logging, but there were strange details in the newspaper articles about the house's construction. Workers had complained about the basement, claiming they heard voices in the walls and felt watched while they worked. 3 different construction crews had quit before the house was finished. Josiah had lived in the house for only 2 years before disappearing without a trace. His son, Mordecai Hartwell, my great-grandfather, inherited the property and lived there until 1923, when he also vanished. The pattern continued with each generation. A Hartwell man would live in the house for a few years, then disappear, leaving behind all his possessions and no explanation. The last Hartwell to live in the house was my grandfather's brother, David, the man I was named after. He disappeared in 1954, and after that the family had sold the house to non-relatives. But here's where it got truly terrifying. According to missing persons reports I found in old newspaper archives, every Hartwell man who'd lived in that house had disappeared on the same date, October 31st, Halloween night. Today was October 29th. I sat in that library, staring at newspaper clippings and property records, understanding that I wasn't just dealing with a random haunting. This was something my family had been connected to for over a century, and now these entities expected me to fulfill some kind of obligation that previous generations of Hartwell men had apparently honored with their lives. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further, because what happened when I returned to the house that night pushed me beyond the limits of human endurance. I couldn't stay away. I knew it was stupid, knew it was exactly what these entities wanted, but I needed answers. If my family had been connected to whatever lived in that basement for generations, I needed to understand what that connection meant and whether there was any way to break it. I returned to the house just after sunset, armed with every piece of paranormal investigation equipment I could buy on short notice. Digital recorders, EMF detectors, infrared thermometers, and a camera with night vision capabilities. I also brought something else, a bag of salt, iron nails, and a small crucifix. If I was going to confront supernatural entities, I wanted every possible protection. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside. The air was charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning storm, and every surface seemed to hum with invisible energy. The whispers started immediately, welcoming me home in that ancient language that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something primitive in my DNA. I forced myself to walk to the basement door. It was standing open, though I distinctly remembered locking it before I fled the night before. The wooden stairs descended into absolute blackness. Even with my flashlight, I couldn't see the bottom. "I know you're down there," I called into the darkness. "I know about the Hartwells. I know about the disappearances. What do you want from me?" The response came from everywhere at once, as if the house itself was speaking. "Come down, David. Come home to us. Come to the deep places where your blood belongs." I descended the stairs one step at a time, my equipment bag clutched in one hand, flashlight in the other. The temperature dropped with each step. By the time I reached the basement floor, my breath was visible in ghostly puffs. The basement had changed. Where before there had been empty concrete and stone walls, now I could see doorways that hadn't existed before, passages leading deeper into the earth than should have been possible. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and I could hear the sound of running water coming from somewhere far below. "Welcome home, David Hartwell," said a voice directly behind me. I spun around and found myself face to face with the most terrifying sight of my life. 3 figures stood at the base of the stairs, tall, impossibly thin, with faces that were almost human but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Their skin was the color of old parchment, their eyes were black holes in their skulls, and when they smiled, I could see rows of teeth that looked like broken glass. "We are the keepers," said the first figure. "We have watched over the deep places since before your kind learned to make fire. We have waited so long for the bloodline to return." The second figure stepped closer, and I could smell decay and earth on its breath. "Your ancestors understood the agreement. They fed us, sustained us, kept us strong. In return, we protected the family line, ensured prosperity, granted power over the living world." The third figure reached out with fingers that were too long, too jointed, like spider legs wrapped in human skin. But the compact was broken. The last David tried to flee his obligations. He was brought back, as they all were brought back, but the line was severed. The family scattered. We have been hungry for so long. Hit the like button if this story is terrifying you, because what they told me next revealed the true horror of my situation. "You are the last David Hartwell," the first keeper continued. "The bloodline ends with you, but it need not end in emptiness. Join us willingly as your ancestors did, and become one of the deep dwellers. Your flesh will sustain us, your soul will strengthen us, and your consciousness will join ours in the spaces beneath the world." I understood now why every Hartwell man had disappeared on Halloween night. It wasn't random, it was a harvest. These entities had been feeding off my family for generations, and now it was my turn to pay a debt I'd never agreed to inherit. "What if I refuse?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. All 3 keepers smiled their glass-toothed smiles. "There is no refusal," they said in unison. "The compact is written in blood and bone. You carry it in your very DNA. Tomorrow night, when the veil is thinnest, you will come to us. You will walk down these stairs of your own free will, and you will join your ancestors in the deep places. And if I try to leave, if I run, run, David Hartwell. Run far, run fast, run to the ends of the earth if you wish." The first keeper's voice was like autumn leaves skittering across concrete. "We are patient. We have waited 70 years for this bloodline to return. We can wait longer, but you will never know peace. Every shadow will hide our presence. Every basement, every cellar, every dark space beneath the earth will call to you. You will hear our voices in your dreams, feel our hunger in your bones, and eventually, tonight, tomorrow, next year, next decade, you will return to us. They always do." I was trapped, bound by the actions of ancestors I'd never known to entities I'd never agreed to serve. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Give me until tomorrow night," I said. "Let me prepare. Say goodbye. Put my affairs in order." The keepers exchanged glances that somehow conveyed vast communications in the space between seconds. "You may have this night and the next day," the second keeper finally said. "Use them as you will. But when Halloween night falls and the clock strikes midnight, you will return to us. The compact will be fulfilled." They began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. But their voices echoed in the basement air long after they were gone. "Tomorrow night, David Hartwell. Tomorrow night, you come home." I stumbled up the basement stairs, my mind racing with desperate possibilities. There had to be a way out of this. Ancient compacts could be broken, couldn't they? There were experts in this kind of thing. Paranormal investigators, demonologists, people who understood supernatural contracts better than I did. But even as I reached for my phone to start making calls, I could feel something changing inside me. A pulling sensation like homesickness, but deeper, more primal. Part of me, some dark corner of my DNA that remembered things my conscious mind couldn't access, was already anticipating tomorrow night. Already eager to join the ancestors I'd never met in the deep places beneath the world. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what I discovered in my final desperate hours of research revealed a possibility I'd never considered. A way the compact might be broken, but only at a cost that might be worse than simply giving in. The rest of that night passed in a blur of frantic research. I called paranormal investigators, emailed university professors who specialized in folklore, and posted desperate questions on forums dedicated to supernatural encounters. Most of the responses were useless, well-meaning advice about sage cleansing and protective circles that clearly came from people who'd never faced anything more threatening than a squeaky floorboard. But one response caught my attention. An email from Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of anthropological studies at the University of Oregon, who had spent her career studying indigenous spiritual practices and ancient belief systems. "Mr. Hartwell," she wrote, "your description matches historical accounts of entities known to Pacific Northwest tribes as the Hunger Below, subterranean beings that formed parasitic relationships with European colonizers who built homes on sacred burial grounds. These compacts typically involved multi-generational obligations, with each family line bound to provide sustenance in exchange for material prosperity. However, there are documented cases of such contracts being nullified through specific ritual processes. I would be willing to meet with you if you believe your situation is genuine." I called her immediately despite the late hour, and found myself talking to a woman who didn't seem surprised by my story. She agreed to meet me at her office first thing in the morning. Dr. Chen was a small, serious woman, in her 50s with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Her office was filled with artifacts from indigenous cultures around the world, and she listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. "The keepers," she said when I finished. "Yes, I've encountered references to them in tribal oral histories. They're old, older than human civilization in this region. They predate the indigenous peoples who originally lived on this land, though those tribes learned to avoid certain areas where the hunger below was strongest." "Can the compact be broken?" I asked desperately. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying something in her notes. "Possibly, but the ritual process is difficult. It requires a willing substitution. Someone else must take your place in the compact. The entities don't particularly care which bloodline feeds them, as long as the spiritual energy maintains the same frequency." My heart sank. So I'd have to condemn someone else to this fate. "Not necessarily someone innocent," she said carefully. "The substitution ritual is designed to redirect the compact to someone who has already forfeited their claim to protection through their own actions. Someone who has caused significant harm to others and shown no remorse. The ritual essentially allows the universe to collect a debt that was already owed." She pulled a slim book from her shelf and opened it to a page covered in symbols I didn't recognize. "There are specific requirements. The substitute must be present willingly at the ritual site. They must understand what is happening and accept their fate. And the original bloodline bearer must perform the transference ritual at the exact moment of the compact's completion, midnight on Halloween night." "Where am I supposed to find someone like that with less than 24 hours notice?" Dr. Chen gave me a look that was both sympathetic and knowing. "Mr. Hartwell, in my experience, the universe has a way of providing what's needed for these situations. People who have done terrible things are often drawn to supernatural events, believing they can use them for their own purposes. Be alert today. Pay attention to who approaches you or shows unusual interest in your situation. She was right, though I didn't realize it at the time. I spent the day putting my affairs in order as much as possible, updating my will, writing letters to the few family members I still spoke to, and trying to come to terms with the possibility that this might be my last day alive. But I also prepared for the ritual Dr. Chen had described, gathering the materials she'd specified and memorizing the words I would need to speak. As the sun began to set on Halloween night, I received a phone call that changed everything. "David Hartwell?" The voice was rough, aggressive, unfamiliar. "Yes? My name is Marcus Webb. I understand you're having some supernatural difficulties." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "How did you get my number?" "I have my ways. Look, I've been tracking unusual paranormal activity in the Salem area for months. Multiple people have reported seeing you at the library, asking questions about entities and old families. I'm what you might call a specialist in these matters." Something about his voice made my skin crawl, but I was desperate enough to listen. "What kind of specialist?" "The kind who knows how to make deals with things that aren't quite human. I've been researching the house on Chemichetta Street, and I know what you're facing. I might be able to help you." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. Marcus Webb turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his 40s, with the kind of desperate energy that comes from someone running from something terrible. His hands shook slightly as he talked, and his eyes kept darting to the windows as if he expected to see something watching us. "I know about the keepers," he said without preamble. "I've been studying them for years, looking for a way to use their power for my own purposes. See, I'm in a bit of trouble myself, legal trouble, financial trouble, the kind of trouble that requires a fresh start in a place where certain people can't find me. What does that have to do with my situation?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with desperate cunning. "I want to make a deal with your basement entities. I want to become one of them, gain their power, their ability to exist between worlds. You need someone to take your place in the compact. I need a way to disappear from my current life permanently. We can help each other." I stared at him, remembering Dr. Chen's words about how the universe provides what's needed. "What exactly are you running from, Marcus?" His smile was unpleasant. "Let's just say I've made some choices that certain people, law enforcement, former business partners, a few wives, don't appreciate. I've hurt people, Mr. Hartwell. A lot of people. And I've never lost a minute of sleep over it." He was exactly what Dr. Chen had described. Someone who had forfeited their claim to protection through their own actions. Someone the universe wouldn't mind collecting a debt from. "Are you saying you'd willingly take my place in this compact?" "Eagerly," Marcus said. "I've researched the keepers for years. I know what they offer. Power, immortality of a sort, freedom from human limitations. It's exactly what I need." We spent the next hour going over the details of the substitution ritual. Marcus seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of joining the entities, which made the whole process easier, but also more disturbing. I was essentially arranging for someone to voluntarily damn themselves, even if they were eager for that damnation. As midnight approached, we drove to the house on Chemichetta Street together. Marcus was practically vibrating with anticipation, while I felt like I was walking to my own execution. Even if the ritual worked, there was no guarantee the keepers would honor the substitution. They might simply take both of us. But I was out of options and out of time. The house was waiting for us, every window dark except for a faint glow emanating from the basement windows, a light that shouldn't have existed, since there were no electric fixtures down there. We entered through the front door, which stood open despite my certainty that I'd locked it. "This is it," Marcus breathed, looking around the interior with hungry eyes. "I can feel them. They're so powerful." The basement door was open, and we could hear the keepers calling from below. "David Hartwell," their voices echoed up the stairs. "Come to us, come home, the compact must be fulfilled." I looked at Marcus one final time, seeing the manic gleam in his eyes, and knew I had to go through with this. Dr. Chen's ritual instructions were burned into my memory. and I had all the necessary components in my bag: salt, iron filings, candles made from human fat that I'd rather not think about how she'd obtained them, and a piece of obsidian carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Remember," I told Marcus as we approached the basement stairs, "once we start this ritual, there's no turning back. The keepers will sense what we're trying to do, and they won't be happy about the substitution." Marcus just grinned, that unpleasant expression that told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was. "I've been waiting for this opportunity my whole life, David. Some people are meant for ordinary existence. Others are meant for power, even if it comes with a price." We descended into the basement together, and immediately I felt the temperature plummet. Our breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the concrete walls. The three keepers were waiting for us, but now they weren't alone. The basement stretched far beyond its original dimensions, with tunnels leading deeper into the earth than should have been physically possible. I could see other figures in the shadows, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The previous victims of the compact, the Hartwell men who had disappeared over the decades, now transformed into something between human and entity. "David Hartwell," the first keeper spoke, its voice like wind through a graveyard. "You have returned to honor the compact, but you bring a stranger to our sacred space. This was not part of the agreement." "I know," I said, setting down my bag and beginning to arrange the ritual components according to Dr. Chen's instructions. "But I'm invoking the right of substitution. This man, Marcus Webb, offers himself willingly to take my place in the compact." The three keepers exchanged those impossibly fast glances again, communicating in ways that transcended human understanding. The shadows in the tunnels began moving closer, and I could hear whispers in that ancient language growing louder and more agitated. "Substitution," the second keeper hissed. "The old laws do allow for substitution, but only under specific circumstances. The replacement must be worthy of our attention, must carry the spiritual weight necessary to sustain our realm." Marcus stepped forward eagerly. "I am worthy. I've spent my entire adult life taking what I wanted from others, manipulating people, destroying lives for my own benefit. I've embezzled millions from charities that help children. I've ruined families through predatory lending practices. And I've never felt a moment of genuine remorse. If you need someone with spiritual debt, you won't find anyone more qualified." The third keeper moved closer to Marcus, studying him with those black hole eyes. "Yes," it said slowly. "Yes, we sense the darkness in you. The accumulated weight of unpaid debts, the spiritual corruption that comes from a lifetime of choosing harm over help. You would feed us well, Marcus Webb, perhaps even better than a Hartwell bloodline bound by ancient obligation rather than personal choice." I began drawing the ritual circle with salt mixed with iron filings, speaking the words "Doctor." Chen had taught me in the original indigenous language she'd reconstructed from tribal oral histories. The keepers watched with growing interest rather than anger, which gave me hope that the substitution might actually work. "But," the first keeper continued, "substitution requires consent from both parties and a demonstration of worthiness. Marcus Webb must prove his commitment by entering our realm willingly and surviving the trial of depths." "What's the trial of depths?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The second keeper smiled, showing those rows of broken glass teeth. "He must descend to the deepest level of our domain and retrieve a token of binding, a shard of the original obsidian altar where the first compact was forged. If he succeeds and returns before dawn, the substitution is complete. If he fails..." The keeper's smile widened. "Well, we will have our offering either way, and you, David Hartwell, will still be bound by blood and bone to honor your family's obligations." Marcus looked toward the tunnels leading deeper into the earth, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. But his greed and desperation quickly overcame any self-preservation instincts he might have had. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "How deep do I have to go?" The third keeper gestured toward the darkest tunnel, one that seemed to descend at an impossible angle into the earth. Follow the path of bones until you reach the chamber of first hungers. The obsidian altar stands at its center, guarded by our oldest servants. Take only a single shard. More than that will trigger protections that even we cannot override. Marcus turned to me one last time. If this works, I want you to know that I'm grateful. I've been running from my debts, financial, legal, and spiritual, for years. This gives me a chance at a different kind of existence, one where those debts don't matter anymore. And if it doesn't work? I asked. He shrugged. Then I'll die down there, which honestly isn't much different from what was waiting for me in the regular world. At least this way, my death might serve a purpose. Comment below if you think Marcus made the right choice, because what happened next tested both of our commitments to this desperate plan. Marcus took one of my flashlights and started down the tunnel. Within minutes, the beam of his light had disappeared into the darkness, and we could hear his footsteps echoing from impossibly far below. The keepers settled in to wait, their forms becoming more solid and defined as midnight approached. "Tell me about the Chamber of First Hungers," I said, partly to fill the oppressive silence and partly because I genuinely wanted to understand what Marcus was walking into. The first keeper's expression became almost nostalgic. "It is where we first learned to sustain ourselves on human spiritual energy, back when your species was young and the barriers between realms were thinner. The chamber exists in a space between your world and ours, accessible only through specific passages like this one. The obsidian altar was carved from a meteorite that fell from the space between stars, and it amplifies the spiritual resonance of any compact made in its presence. And the guardians Marcus mentioned, our oldest servants," the second keeper replied. "Humans who joined us willingly in the earliest days, before compacts and bloodline obligations became necessary. They have been transformed by centuries of exposure to our realm, becoming something more than human, but less than us. They guard the altar not from malice, but from instinct. They will test Marcus's resolve, his commitment to transformation." From deep below, we heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Marcus screaming. Not a scream of pain, but of absolute terror, the kind of sound that comes from seeing something that breaks the human mind's ability to process reality. The third keeper tilted its head, listening. "He has reached the guardians. Now we will learn whether his spiritual weight is sufficient for our purposes." The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. Minutes passed with no sound from below. I found myself holding my breath, listening for any indication of what was happening in the depths. Then we heard footsteps again, but they sounded different, heavier with an odd rhythm that didn't quite match human walking patterns. Whatever was coming back up that tunnel, it might not be entirely Marcus anymore. "Regardless of the outcome," the first keeper said, "you have honored the old laws by attempting substitution through proper ritual channels. If Marcus Webb succeeds, you will be released from your bloodline obligations. If he fails, you will join us as planned, but we will remember your respect for our customs." The footsteps grew closer, and I could see a faint light beginning to emerge from the tunnel. But the light wasn't the steady white beam of a flashlight. It was a pulsing, organic glow that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Marcus emerged from the tunnel, but he was changed. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. His eyes reflected light like an animal's, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth had become sharper, more pointed. In his hand, he clutched a piece of black obsidian that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I got it," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before. "I met the guardians. They showed me things. Beautiful, terrible things. I understand now what I'm becoming, and I want it more than I've ever wanted anything." The keepers examined the obsidian shard, passing it between themselves with expressions of satisfaction. "It is authentic," the second keeper pronounced. "The substitution ritual may proceed. What happened next is difficult to describe in terms that make rational sense." The basement filled with that ancient language, spoken not just by the keepers but by all the shadows in the tunnels, creating a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the earth itself. The temperature dropped even further, and the walls began to pulse with that same organic light Marcus now emanated. The ritual circle I had drawn with salt and iron began to glow, and I felt something fundamental shifting in the spiritual fabric around us. It was like reality was being rewritten in real time, with my family's century-old obligations being transferred from my bloodline to Marcus's willing acceptance. "It is done," the first keeper announced as the glowing faded, and the temperature began to return to merely cold instead of supernatural freezing. "Marcus Webb, you are now bound to us by choice rather than blood, which makes your offering even more valuable. David Hartwell, you are released from your family's compact." I should have felt relief, but instead I felt hollow, emptied out. The weight I'd carried since learning about my family's history was gone, but its absence left me feeling unmoored from everything I thought I knew about myself. Marcus, meanwhile, was practically glowing with excitement. "When do I join you? When does the transformation complete?" "Now," said the third keeper, and Marcus's expression shifted from excitement to confusion to terror as he realized what that meant. The shadows from the tunnels surged forward, engulfing Marcus in darkness. I heard him scream once, not in fear this time, but in a strange mixture of agony and ecstasy. The darkness pulsed and writhed around him for several minutes, then gradually withdrew. Where Marcus had been standing, there was now something that might have once been human but clearly wasn't anymore. It was taller, thinner, with skin like old parchment and eyes like black holes. It looked at me with an expression that was still recognizably Marcus, but filtered through something alien and hungry. "Thank you, David," it said in a voice like rustling leaves. "You've given me exactly what I needed, a way to escape from everything I was and become something with real power. Let me know in the comments if you think I made the right choice, because the consequences of that night extended far beyond what I could have imagined." The entity that had been Marcus Webb turned to follow the keepers into the deeper tunnels. But before it disappeared, it looked back at me one more time. "You should know," it said. "The substitution doesn't end the connection entirely. You're free from the compact, but you'll always be able to see us, hear us, sense when we're near. The Hartwell bloodline carries psychic sensitivity. That's what made your family valuable to us in the first place. You can choose to use that gift to help others who find themselves in supernatural situations, or you can try to ignore it and go back to your normal life. But the sensitivity will never go away." Then it was gone, vanishing into the tunnels with the keepers and leaving me alone in a basement that was rapidly returning to its original dimensions. The impossible passages were closing, the stone walls were solidifying back into ordinary concrete, and within minutes, I was standing in a perfectly normal basement with nothing but my ritual supplies and the lingering smell of something ancient and otherworldly. I climbed the stairs on shaking legs, emerged into my kitchen, and immediately called Dr. Chen. Despite the late hour, she answered on the second ring. "It's done," I told her. "The substitution worked." "How do you feel?" she asked. "Empty, relieved, terrified. I'm not sure. The entity that used to be Marcus said I'd retain some kind of psychic sensitivity. Is that normal for these situations?" "Very normal," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Bloodlines that have been connected to supernatural entities for generations develop certain abilities as a survival mechanism. You'll probably find that you can sense paranormal activity, see spirits that others can't, maybe even help people who are facing situations similar to what you experienced. I never asked for any of this. None of us ask for the gifts we're given," she said gently. "But you can choose how to use them. There are others out there facing supernatural threats they don't understand, people who need someone with your experience and sensitivity to guide them to safety." She was right, though it would be months before I fully understood what she meant. I spent the next several weeks trying to return to normal life. I went back to work, attempted to establish routines, and told myself that the whole experience had been a one-time nightmare that was finally over. But the psychic sensitivity Marcus had warned me about was real and persistent. I began seeing things that others couldn't, shadows that moved independently, cold spots that indicated spiritual activity, and occasionally, full apparitions of people who had died but couldn't move on. At first, these encounters terrified me. I'd spent my entire life as a rational, logical person, and suddenly I was living in a world where the impossible was routine. The first time I helped someone else was almost by accident. I was at a grocery store in downtown Salem when I noticed a young woman in her 20s who kept looking over her shoulder with obvious fear. What caught my attention wasn't her nervous behavior. Plenty of people feel unsafe in public, but the shadow I could see following her. It was humanoid but wrong, with too many joints and movements that didn't match the way shadows should behave when cast by physical objects. Share your thoughts in the comments about whether I should have approached her, because this decision changed both of our lives. I followed her outside, not entirely sure what I was planning to say. How do you approach a stranger and tell them they're being followed by something supernatural? "Excuse me," I said as she reached her car. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think you might be in danger from something that isn't entirely human." She spun around and I could see recognition in her eyes, not of me, but of the situation I was describing. "You can see it too," she whispered. "The shadow thing that follows me everywhere." Her name was Jennifer, and her story was heartbreakingly familiar. She'd recently inherited her grandmother's house in Salem, and had been experiencing escalating supernatural activity. Objects moving on their own, voices in empty rooms, and the persistent shadow that followed her during the day and stood at the foot of her bed at night. "My grandmother always said the house was protected, that she had an understanding with the spirits there," Jennifer explained as we sat in a coffee shop, both of us keeping watch for the shadow entity. "But since she died last month, whatever agreement she had seems to have broken down. The spirits are angry and they blame me for her death." I spent the next several hours helping Jennifer understand what she was facing and researching her grandmother's history. It turned out that the elderly woman had been what some people call a spirit mediator, someone who helped restless ghosts resolve their unfinished business so they could move on to whatever comes next. She'd been managing several dozen spirits who were attached to various locations around Salem, keeping them calm and preventing them from tormenting the living. With her death, those spirits had become agitated and directionless. They weren't malevolent, just confused and frightened, but their supernatural energy was manifesting in ways that terrorized Jennifer. The solution was actually simpler than what I'd faced with the basement entities. Jennifer needed to learn how to communicate with the spirits and either help them resolve their unfinished business or find someone else who could take over her grandmother's mediator role. Working with Dr. Chen, I was able to help Jennifer make contact with the spirits in a controlled way. Most of them just needed acknowledgement and assistance with minor earthly concerns. Messages delivered to living relatives, forgotten possessions located and properly disposed of, or simple recognition of their continued existence. Within a week, the supernatural activity in Jennifer's house had calmed to manageable levels, and the shadow entity had moved on to whatever realm spirits inhabit when they're no longer bound to the physical world. "Thank you," Jennifer told me as we finished the cleansing ritual Dr. Chen had recommended. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't approached me that day." "Probably figured it out on your own eventually," I said. "People are more resilient than they think when it comes to supernatural situations. They just need someone to tell them they're not going crazy." Hit the like button if you think I made the right decision to help Jennifer, because her case was just the beginning of what would become my new purpose in life. Word spread quickly in Salem's small community of people who had experienced paranormal encounters. Jennifer mentioned my help to a friend who was dealing with poltergeist activity in her apartment. That friend told someone else who was seeing the ghost of a previous tenant in his basement. Within a month, I was getting calls from people all over Oregon who needed assistance with supernatural problems. I discovered that there were far more people facing paranormal situations than I'd ever imagined. The difference was that most of them suffered in silence, convinced that no one would believe them, or that they were losing their minds. Having someone who could not only see what they were experiencing but also help them find solutions was invaluable to them. My work with Dr. Chen expanded from a single consultation to a regular partnership. She provided the academic research and historical context, while I offered the psychic sensitivity and practical experience with dangerous entities. Together, We helped dozens of people reclaim their lives from supernatural threats. Some cases were simple, confused spirits who just needed guidance to move on, or minor poltergeist activity that could be resolved with basic cleansing rituals. Others were much more complex and dangerous. I'll never forget the case of the Morrison family in Portland, whose teenage daughter had become possessed by something that claimed to be a demon, but was actually a fragment of a much older and more powerful entity that had been accidentally awakened during a basement renovation. That case required 3 weeks of intensive research, multiple ritual interventions, and the cooperation of 2 other psychically sensitive individuals before we could safely separate the entity fragment from the girl and banish it back to whatever dimension it had originated from. Or the haunted apartment building in Eugene, where a previous tenant had died by suicide and was unconsciously trapping other residents in cycles of depression and despair. That spirit wasn't malevolent. It was just so consumed by its own emotional pain that it was projecting that pain onto everyone around it. Helping that ghost find peace required not just supernatural intervention, but also a deep understanding of mental health and suicide prevention. Each case taught me something new about the world beyond ordinary human perception. I learned that most supernatural entities aren't evil. They're just operating according to different rules and needs than living humans understand. The truly dangerous ones, like the keepers in my basement, are relatively rare. Most paranormal encounters involve spirits who are lost, confused, or trying to communicate something important to the living world. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because my work with paranormal cases has shown me that the supernatural world is far stranger and more complex than any horror movie could portray. But not every case ended successfully. About 6 months after the substitution ritual, I received a call that reminded me just how dangerous this work could be. "David, this is Sarah Chen. I need your help with something urgent." "Doctor." Chen's voice was tight with worry, which immediately put me on alert. In all our work together, I'd never heard her sound truly frightened. "What's wrong?" "It's about Marcus Webb, the entity he became. It's been evolving, growing stronger, and I think it's planning something that could affect far more people than just the residents of Salem." My blood went cold. "What kind of something?" "I've been monitoring supernatural activity levels across the Pacific Northwest since your substitution ritual, and there's been a steady increase in dangerous encounters. Possessions, demonic manifestations, people disappearing near sites with historical paranormal activity. The pattern suggests that something is actively destabilizing the barriers between our world and darker dimensions." "And you think Marcus is responsible?" "I think the entity he became is using his human knowledge and memories to identify vulnerabilities in our reality's defenses. He understands both human psychology and supernatural power now, which makes him incredibly dangerous." Dr. Chen was right to be worried. Over the next several weeks, I began noticing changes in my own psychic sensitivity. The spirit world seemed more active, more visible, as if the boundary between dimensions was becoming thinner. Other psychically sensitive people I'd met through my casework reported similar experiences. Then the disappearances started. People with strong psychic abilities, mediums, fortune tellers, anyone who had documented supernatural encounters, were vanishing without a trace, not just in Oregon, but across the entire West Coast. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. "It's recruiting," Dr. Chen explained when we met to discuss the situation. "The entity that was Marcus is building an army of psychically gifted humans, probably to help it break down the barriers between dimensions entirely." "Why would it want to do that?" "Think about it from its perspective. It spent its human life taking advantage of people, accumulating power and wealth at others' expense. Now it has supernatural abilities, but is still bound by the Keeper's rules and limitations. If it could merge our world with the supernatural realm, it would have access to billions of potential victims instead of just the few people who stumble into paranormal situations." The implications were terrifying. An entity with Marcus's amoral human intelligence and supernatural power, backed by an army of kidnapped psychics and allied with other dangerous spirits, could cause chaos on an unprecedented scale. What can we do to stop it? Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Theoretically, the substitution ritual I taught you created a spiritual connection between you and the entity. You released your family's compact to it, but that transfer established a link. If we could find where it's operating from and perform a reversal ritual, we might be able to recall the entity back to its original binding. You mean bring Marcus back to the basement where this all started? Not Marcus. He's gone, fully transformed. But we might be able to force the entity back to the Keeper's realm, where they could contain it again. The plan was dangerous and had a low chance of success, but it was better than letting Marcus's supernatural form continue its campaign of kidnapping and dimensional destabilization. Our investigation led us to an abandoned lumber mill outside of Astoria, Oregon, where several of the missing psychics had last been seen. The mill had been built in the 1920s on the site of a former indigenous burial ground, exactly the kind of location where the barriers between worlds were naturally thin. Comment below what you think we found at that lumber mill, because the reality was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. When we arrived at the mill just after sunset, the building was buzzing with supernatural energy. Even Dr. Chen, who wasn't psychically sensitive, could feel the wrongness in the air. The temperature around the building was at least 20 degrees colder than the surrounding forest, and we could see unnatural lights moving behind the broken windows. We entered through a gap in the fence surrounding the property, carrying the materials for the reversal ritual and hoping we weren't walking into a trap. The interior of the mill had been transformed into something between a supernatural laboratory and a cult gathering place. The missing psychics were there, at least 30 people arranged in a circle around what had once been the mill's main production floor. But they weren't prisoners in any conventional sense. They were connected to each other and to the entity that had been Marcus through visible streams of spiritual energy, like a network of glowing cables running between their minds. At the center of the circle stood the entity itself, no longer recognizably human at all. It had grown to nearly 8 feet tall, its form shifting and flowing like liquid shadow given substance. When it spoke, its voice came from multiple directions at once. "David Hartwell," it said, and I could still hear echoes of Marcus's personality beneath the alien harmonics. "I wondered when you would come looking for me. Do you see what I've accomplished? These people were wasting their gifts, using their psychic abilities for parlor tricks and seances. I've given them purpose." "You've enslaved them," I said, beginning to set up the reversal ritual components while Dr. Chen kept watch at the mill's entrance. "Enslaved?" The entity laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I've liberated them from the limitations of human existence. Through me, they can access powers they never dreamed of. Through them, I can reshape reality to eliminate the arbitrary boundaries between dimensions." I could see the kidnapped psychics more clearly now, and what I saw made my stomach turn. They were still conscious, still aware, but their minds had been partially merged with the entity's consciousness. They were experiencing its alien thoughts and desires as if they were their own, which explained why they weren't trying to escape or resist. "The reversal ritual won't work, David," the entity continued. "I'm no longer bound by the original compact. I've evolved beyond the Keeper's control, beyond the limitations they tried to impose on me. Soon, I'll have enough power to tear open a permanent gateway between our world and the hunger dimension. Imagine the feeding opportunities when every human on Earth is exposed to supernatural predation." That's when I understood the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just about stopping a single dangerous entity. It was about preventing an apocalyptic merger of dimensions that would make every horror story ever told look like a children's fairy tale. Dissection. Chen had finished her preparations and gave me the signal to begin the ritual. But as I started speaking the words of reversal, the entity and its network of enslaved psychics began to fight back. The spiritual energy connecting the kidnapped people flared brighter, and I could feel their combined psychic power pressing against my mind like a vice. The entity itself began to grow larger and more substantial, drawing power from its unwilling servants to strengthen its resistance to the ritual. "You cannot stop what has already been set in motion," it roared, and cracks began appearing in the mill's walls as reality itself started to buckle under the strain of conflicting supernatural forces. "The barriers are already weakening. In minutes, not hours, the gateway will be permanent and irreversible." I could see it was telling the truth. Behind the entity, the air itself was beginning to tear open, revealing glimpses of the hunger dimension, a realm of endless darkness populated by creatures that made the keepers look benign by comparison. The reversal ritual wasn't strong enough to overcome the entity's evolved power, but I had one more option, something dangerous and probably suicidal, but potentially effective. Instead of trying to force the entity back to its original binding, I could transfer that binding to myself. Not permanently. I wasn't trying to become the new Marcus, but long enough to disrupt the entity's connection to its psychic network and collapse the dimensional gateway it was creating. "Dr. Chen," I called over the growing supernatural chaos, "if I transfer the binding to myself temporarily, can you complete a banishment ritual while the entity is weakened?" She understood immediately what I was proposing. "It could kill you, David. The spiritual shock of bonding with an entity that powerful. But it would work? Probably. But you'd need to maintain the connection for at least 5 minutes while I perform the banishment. I don't know if your mind can survive that level of supernatural contamination." I looked at the dimensional gateway, which was now wide enough that I could see creatures from the hunger dimension beginning to push through into our world. In 5 minutes, it would be too late to stop them. "Do it," I said, and began modifying the reversal ritual to create a temporary binding between myself and the entity. "Let me know if you want me to continue with the final confrontation, because what happened next pushed me beyond every limit I thought I had." The moment I spoke the binding words, agony beyond description flooded through my nervous system. It was like being struck by lightning made of pure malevolence. Every nerve ending in my body screaming as the entity's alien consciousness forced its way into my mind. But it worked. The spiritual connections between the entity and its network of kidnapped psychics flickered and wavered as the creature's attention was suddenly focused on resisting my binding attempt. Several of the enslaved people collapsed, freed from the mental network but overwhelmed by the psychic backlash. I could feel the entity's thoughts mixing with my own, and they were even more horrifying than I'd anticipated. Marcus's human memories were still there, but they'd been twisted into something unrecognizable. Every cruel act he'd committed in life had been amplified and refined into pure malice. Every person he'd hurt was now a source of satisfaction rather than regret. The transformation into a supernatural entity hadn't changed his fundamental nature. It had simply given him the power to express that nature on a cosmic scale. Through the binding connection, I could sense the entity's ultimate plan. It didn't just want to merge dimensions for feeding purposes. It wanted to remake reality itself, transforming the entire universe into a place where beings like itself could exist without limitation. Humanity would become nothing more than cattle, and concepts like compassion, love, and sacrifice would be eliminated from existence. "You cannot resist me, David Hartwell." The entity's voice echoed inside my skull. "I am what Marcus Webb chose to become, but I am also what you could become. Release the binding and join me willingly. Together we could rule the merged reality instead of being consumed by it." For a terrifying moment, I could feel myself being tempted by the offer. The entity's power was intoxicating, and through our connection, I could sense the abilities I could gain by accepting its proposal. Immortality, control over supernatural forces, the ability to reshape reality according to my desires. But then I thought about Jennifer, struggling with her grandmother's spirits and needing someone to tell her she wasn't going crazy. I thought about the Morrison family, nearly destroyed by an entity that fed on their daughter's innocence. I thought about all the people I'd helped over the past months, ordinary humans who'd found themselves facing impossible situations and needed someone with experience to guide them to safety. The entity was offering me power, but what I'd found through helping others was something much more valuable: purpose. "Dr. Chen, now!" I shouted, fighting to maintain the binding even as the entity tried to break free. She began the banishment ritual, her voice strong and clear despite the supernatural chaos erupting around us. The words were in the same indigenous language she'd taught me for the substitution ritual, but this time they carried the weight of absolute finality. This wasn't about transferring the entity to someone else. This was about sending it back to the space between dimensions where it belonged. The entity realized what was happening and began fighting both the binding and the banishment simultaneously. The psychic pressure was incredible, like having my skull squeezed in a vice while my brain was set on fire. I could taste blood in my mouth and feel something warm running from my nose and ears. But I held on. Through pure, stubborn determination and the memory of everyone I'd helped, I maintained the binding connection while Dr. Chen completed the banishment ritual. The dimensional gateway began to collapse, sucking the creatures that had emerged from the hunger dimension back into their native realm. The entity that had been Marcus fought against the pull, its form becoming more and more translucent as the banishment took effect. "This isn't over, David Hartwell," it screamed as it was drawn toward the closing gateway. "I know your true nature now. I've seen the darkness you carry, the potential for cruelty that exists in every human soul. You will become like me eventually. They always do." Then it was gone, pulled through the collapsing gateway and back to whatever space between dimensions it had emerged from. The kidnapped psychics were unconscious but breathing, their minds finally free from the entity's influence. The supernatural energy that had been tearing the mill apart dissipated, leaving us in a building that was damaged but no longer actively dangerous. I collapsed, the binding connection finally severed, and found myself unable to move or speak for several minutes. Dr. Chen knelt beside me, checking my pulse and looking for signs of serious injury. "Is it over?" I finally managed to ask. "The immediate threat is over," she said carefully. "The entity has been banished, the gateway is closed, and these people will recover. But, the binding you created with the entity left traces. You've been exposed to a level of supernatural contamination that would have killed most people. Your psychic sensitivity is going to be much stronger now, probably permanently. You'll see more, sense more, be drawn into more dangerous situations." She was right. Even as we waited for emergency responders to arrive and help the kidnapped psychics, I could already feel the change. The spirit world was more vivid, more present than it had ever been. I could see layers of reality that had been invisible to me before, including some things that probably shouldn't be visible to human perception. But I'd made my choice. The entity had offered me power through corruption, and I'd chosen purpose through service instead. The increased psychic sensitivity would make my work helping others more effective, even if it also made my life more complicated and dangerous. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because the final revelation about my family's true connection to the supernatural world changed everything I thought I knew about my purpose in life. 6 months after the mill incident, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a collection of documents and photographs that had apparently been stored in a safety deposit box for decades, waiting for the right moment to be delivered to the surviving Hartwell heir. The documents revealed the truth about my family's relationship with the supernatural world, and it wasn't what I'd believed based on the historical records I'd found in the Salem library. Yes, my ancestors had made a compact with the Keepers, but it hadn't been a simple feeding agreement where Hartwell men were sacrificed every generation. That was the corrupted version of the compact, twisted by decades of misunderstanding and fear. The original agreement, documented in papers signed by my great-great-grandfather Josiah Hartwell, was completely different. The Hartwell men weren't meant to be consumed by the entities. They were meant to be guardians, protectors, who used their inherited psychic sensitivity to prevent dangerous supernatural forces from harming ordinary people. Josiah had been what Dr. Chen would now call a supernatural mediator, someone who maintained balance between the human world and the realm of entities that existed just beyond ordinary perception. The Keepers weren't predators who demanded human sacrifice. They were guardians themselves, ancient beings tasked with preventing truly malevolent forces from crossing into our dimension. The compact was meant to ensure that each generation of Hartwell men would inherit not just psychic sensitivity, but also the knowledge and responsibility to continue this protective work. The feeding aspect I'd discovered was a corruption that had developed over time, as successive generations lost understanding of their true purpose and began to fear the very entities they were meant to work alongside. My grandfather hadn't been consumed by the Keepers. He'd been recruited by them, transformed into a guardian who could operate in both the human and supernatural realms simultaneously. The family stories about disappearing Hartwell men weren't about death, but about transcendence to a higher level of protective service. Hit the subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about families with hidden supernatural purposes, because this revelation completely changed how I understood my own destiny. The photographs in the package showed my grandfather and great-grandfather working alongside the Keepers, documenting supernatural threats and protecting communities across Oregon and Washington. There were images of them performing cleansing rituals at haunted locations, mediating disputes between human spirits and living families, and even collaborating with indigenous spiritual leaders to strengthen the barriers between dimensions. But the most shocking photograph was the most recent one, taken just 3 years ago. It showed my grandfather, looking exactly as he had when I was a child, standing outside a house in Portland where I'd later learn a family had been terrorized by a poltergeist, until the activity suddenly stopped without explanation. My grandfather was still alive, still working, still protecting people from supernatural threats. He hadn't aged because his transformation had made him something between human and entity, giving him the longevity needed to fulfill his guardian responsibilities across multiple human generations. The final document in the package was a letter addressed to me personally, written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. David, if you're reading this, it means you've completed your first major supernatural intervention and proven yourself worthy of knowing the truth about our family's real legacy. The compact was never about sacrifice, it was about service. The Keepers and I have been watching your work over the past months, and we're proud of how you've chosen to use your inherited abilities. The entity that Marcus Webb became was exactly the kind of threat our family was meant to prevent. By stopping it, you've fulfilled the true purpose of the Hartwell bloodline without needing the full transformation that I accepted. Your psychic sensitivity and commitment to helping others makes you more valuable as a human guardian than as a transcended entity. You have a choice to make. You can continue your current path, helping individuals with supernatural problems while living a mostly normal human life. Or you can accept full initiation into the Guardian Network, gaining additional abilities and knowledge, but also taking on responsibilities that would separate you from ordinary human existence. Either choice serves the greater purpose. The world needs both human mediators like you currently are, and transcended guardians like I became. The important thing is that you choose based on genuine understanding rather than fear or obligation. I'm proud of the man you've become, David. Your parents would be proud too. They died protecting a family from a demonic infestation in Seattle, sacrificing their lives to prevent the entity from possessing 3 young children. Their deaths weren't random. They were heroes who understood that some things are worth dying to protect. Whatever you choose, know that you're not alone. There are others like us, families and individuals who've dedicated themselves to maintaining the balance between worlds. Dr. Sarah Chen is part of this network, as are several of the people you've helped over the past months. Jennifer, the woman you assisted with her grandmother's spirits, has decided to take over her grandmother's mediator role permanently. The Morrison family's daughter has developed her own psychic abilities after her possession experience and is learning to use them constructively. The supernatural world isn't going away, David. If anything, it's becoming more active as humanity's technology and population growth create new vulnerabilities and intersections between dimensions. The world needs guardians now more than ever. I'll be in touch soon to discuss your decision. Until then, continue the work you're already doing. Every person you help strengthens the barriers between our world and the forces that would consume it. With love and respect, Grandfather Thomas Hartwell. Let me know in the comments if you think I should accept full guardian status or continue working as a human mediator, because this decision will determine the rest of my supernatural career. I spent the next several weeks considering my grandfather's offer, while continuing to help people with paranormal problems. The work was rewarding but increasingly dangerous, as my enhanced psychic sensitivity drew me into more complex cases. There was the haunted hospital in Eugene, where the ghosts of former patients were preventing current patients from healing properly. That case required 3 weeks of delicate negotiations between the living and the dead, plus coordination with medical staff who thought they were dealing with unusual psychological complications rather than genuine supernatural interference. Then there was the possessed antique shop in Bend, where a collection of cursed objects had been accumulating negative energy for decades until they created a localized reality distortion that was affecting everyone within a 6-block radius. Resolving that situation required tracking down the provenance of 47 different cursed items and either destroying them safely or returning them to places where their spiritual energy could be neutralized. But the case that finally helped me make my decision was also the most personal. I received a call from a woman in Sacramento whose 15-year-old son had been experiencing supernatural encounters that sounded eerily familiar. Voices in his bedroom walls, cold spots that followed him around the house, and the sense of being watched by something invisible but malevolent. When I arrived at their house and met the family, I immediately recognized the spiritual signature of the disturbance. It was similar to what I'd experienced in my own basement, but weaker and more confused. The boy, whose name was Tyler, had inherited psychic sensitivity from a family line that had once been connected to supernatural entities, but had lost track of their obligations over the generations. The voices Tyler was hearing weren't trying to harm him. They were trying to recruit him, to restore a broken compact that had been abandoned when his great-grandfather had fled California in the 1940s after a supernatural encounter that terrified him into hiding his family's psychic heritage. "It's like they want me to go somewhere," Tyler explained as we sat in his bedroom while his parents waited anxiously downstairs. "Every night they whisper about a place underground where I'm supposed to meet them. They say I have a debt to pay, an obligation that my family ran away from." Comment below if you've ever felt called to something supernatural that you didn't understand. Because Tyler's situation was about to become a test of everything I'd learned about guardian work. Using the psychic sensitivity I'd inherited and enhanced through my own supernatural experiences, I was able to make direct contact with the entities that were calling to Tyler. They were similar to the keepers I'd encountered, ancient beings tasked with maintaining barriers between dimensions. But these were weaker, depleted by decades of having no human guardian to work with. Tyler's great-grandfather had been meant to serve as their human partner, helping them identify and neutralize supernatural threats in the Sacramento area. When he'd abandoned his post out of fear, the entities had been forced to operate without human assistance, gradually losing their effectiveness and becoming desperate for a replacement. But Tyler was just a child, unprepared and untrained for the kind of work that supernatural guardianship required. If he answered their call in his current state, he'd likely be overwhelmed by the spiritual pressure and either die or be permanently damaged by the experience. I had 2 options. I could help Tyler's family relocate and hide from the entities, the way his great-grandfather had done, which would leave the Sacramento area without supernatural protection and eventually lead to the entities becoming malevolent from isolation and desperation. Or I could take over Tyler's inherited obligation myself, becoming the guardian that area needed, while training Tyler to eventually take on the role when he was mature enough to handle it. The decision was actually easy once I understood the full situation. Tyler was an innocent kid who deserved to have a normal childhood and the freedom to choose his own path when he came of age. The people of Sacramento deserved protection from supernatural threats, and I had the abilities, experience, and support network needed to serve as a guardian effectively. That night, I performed a modified version of the substitution ritual I'd originally used with Marcus. But this time I was transferring Tyler's inherited obligation to myself voluntarily, with full understanding of what I was accepting. The entities were initially suspicious. They'd been betrayed by Tyler's great-grandfather and were wary of trusting another human. But when they sensed my previous experience with the Keepers and my genuine commitment to protective work, they accepted the transfer. The ritual was much less traumatic than my binding with Marcus's entity had been. These guardians were benevolent, focused on protection rather than consumption. Accepting their partnership felt like gaining allies rather than being invaded by something alien and hostile. Tyler's supernatural experiences stopped immediately, and his family was able to return to normal life. I, on the other hand, found myself with a new set of responsibilities and abilities that extended far beyond what I'd been capable of as an independent mediator. Working with the Sacramento Guardians, I could sense supernatural threats across a much wider geographical area. I could communicate directly with benevolent spirits and entities, making negotiations and mediations much more efficient. And I had access to protective abilities that allowed me to shield innocent people from supernatural harm, even when I couldn't immediately resolve the source of that harm. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the hidden network of supernatural guardians protecting humanity from paranormal threats, because Tyler's case was just the beginning of my expanded guardian work. Over the following months, I discovered that my grandfather had been right about the guardian network. There were dozens of families and individuals across the western United States who had similar arrangements with protective entities, and they formed an informal but effective system for monitoring and responding to supernatural threats. Dr. Chen introduced me to a rancher in Montana whose family had been working with earth spirits to prevent demonic entities from using abandoned mining tunnels as invasion routes from deeper dimensions. There was a lighthouse keeper in Northern California whose great-grandmother had made a compact with sea spirits to protect ships from supernatural storms that could drag vessels into underwater realms populated by hungry ghosts. In Phoenix, I met a woman whose family had been mediating between human urban development and the spirits of the Sonoran Desert for 3 generations, preventing the displacement of indigenous spiritual entities from turning into hostile supernatural activity. And in Seattle, I worked with a man whose family had been maintaining protective barriers around the city's underground tunnel system, which had become a highway for entities traveling between the physical world and various supernatural dimensions. Each guardian had their own specialties and their own partnerships with different types of protective entities. But we all shared the same fundamental purpose: maintaining the balance between the human world and the supernatural realm in ways that protected innocent people from forces they couldn't understand or defend against. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, but it was also deeply meaningful. Every person I helped, every supernatural threat I neutralized, every crisis I prevented contributed to the safety and stability of the world in ways that most people would never know or appreciate. And that was exactly how it should be. The Guardian Network succeeded by operating invisibly, preventing supernatural disasters rather than responding to them after they'd already caused harm and attracted attention. 6 months after accepting my role as Tyler's substitute guardian, I received another visit from my grandfather. This time, he appeared in person rather than just sending documents through the mail. He looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood, still in his 50s with the same kind eyes and gentle smile that had made him my favorite family member before his mysterious disappearance. But now I could see the supernatural energy that surrounded him, the evidence of his transformation into something between human and entity. "You've exceeded our expectations, David," he told me as we sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee like we had when I was 10 years old. "Your work with Tyler's situation showed remarkable wisdom and compassion. Your interventions in Sacramento, Portland, and Eugene have prevented at least 3 major supernatural crises that could have affected thousands of people." "It feels like I'm just getting started," I said. "Every case I resolve leads to 2 more cases that need attention." "That's the nature of guardian work," he agreed. "The supernatural world is vast and complex, and the interactions between dimensions create constant challenges, that require human insight to resolve effectively. But that's also what makes the work worthwhile. You're not just solving individual problems, you're maintaining the stability of reality itself. He went on to explain that my success as a regional guardian had earned me an invitation to join the inner circle of the network, a small group of the most experienced and capable guardians who handled threats that were too dangerous or complex for regional teams to manage alone. The entity that Marcus became wasn't unique, my grandfather told me. There are others like it, corrupted humans who've gained supernatural power and use it for selfish or destructive purposes. There are also entities from other dimensions who see our world as a resource to be exploited rather than a reality to be protected. And there are supernatural forces that aren't consciously malevolent, but are simply too alien and powerful for safe interaction with human society. Hit the like button if you think I should join the inner circle of guardians, because the final case my grandfather described would test every skill I'd developed over the past year. The case he wanted me to help with involved a situation in Las Vegas that had been developing for several years. A casino developer had unknowingly built his latest resort on top of a site that had been sacred to multiple indigenous tribes, creating a confluence of spiritual energy that was attracting entities from across the southwestern United States. But instead of the usual haunting or poltergeist activity that typically resulted from disturbing sacred sites, this situation had created something much more dangerous, a stable portal between our dimension and what the Guardian Network called the Echo Realm, a supernatural space where human thoughts and emotions took on independent existence. The casino was literally manifesting the hopes, fears, and desires of its visitors as semi-physical entities that roamed the building and surrounding area. Gamblers' desperate need to win big was creating predatory spirits that fed on financial desperation. The resort's focus on luxury and excess was spawning entities that amplified greed and materialism in anyone who encountered them. And the underlying despair that drove many people to gambling in the first place was manifesting as shadow creatures that whispered suicidal thoughts to vulnerable visitors. The situation was getting worse every day, and conventional methods of spiritual cleansing weren't effective because the portal was constantly generating new entities faster than they could be banished or neutralized. "We need someone with your experience in complex binding and substitution rituals," my grandfather explained. "The portal can't be destroyed. It's too stable and too deeply rooted in the convergence of sacred sites. But it might be possible to redirect its energy, to transform it from a source of parasitic entities into something that actually benefits both the human and supernatural communities." The solution he proposed was ambitious and risky. Instead of trying to close the portal, we would attempt to convert it into a controlled gateway that could be used for beneficial exchanges between dimensions. Benevolent entities could use it to visit our world safely, while human guardians could travel through it to resolve supernatural problems that originated in other realms. The ritual would require a team of 5 experienced guardians working in perfect coordination, plus the cooperation of the indigenous spiritual leaders whose ancestors had originally sanctified the site. If it worked, it would create a permanent resource that could make guardian work more effective across the entire western United States. If it failed, it could destabilize the portal entirely, potentially creating a permanent tear between dimensions that would flood our world with uncontrolled supernatural entities. "Are you ready for that level of responsibility?" my grandfather asked. I thought about Tyler safely living a normal teenage life because I'd been willing to take on his inherited burden. I thought about Jennifer, successfully managing her grandmother's spiritual legacy with confidence and competence. I thought about the Morrison family, whole and happy because we'd been able to separate their daughter from the entity that had been possessing her. Every person I'd helped had been made possible by my decision to use my inherited abilities for protection rather than personal gain. The work had been challenging, sometimes dangerous, and always demanding. But it had also been the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. "I'm ready," I told my grandfather. "When do we start? Let me know in the comments what you think happened with the Las Vegas portal ritual. because that experience taught me the true scope of what guardians are protecting humanity from. The Las Vegas ritual took place 3 weeks later, on a new moon when the barriers between dimensions were naturally thinner. Our team consisted of myself, my grandfather, Dr. Chen, and 2 other guardians I'd never worked with before. A woman from Denver, whose family specialized in mountain spirit negotiations, and a man from Albuquerque who had extensive experience with desert entity management. We also had the support of 3 indigenous spiritual leaders who had volunteered to help us redirect the portal's energy in ways that honored their ancestors' original intentions for the site. The ritual itself was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Instead of trying to bind or banish supernatural forces, we were attempting to guide and reshape them, to transform chaotic spiritual energy into something structured and beneficial. It worked, but not without cost. The process required each of us to temporarily merge our consciousness with the portal's energy, experiencing firsthand the hopes, fears, and desperate desires of every person who had visited the casino since its construction. The psychological pressure was overwhelming, like having thousands of people's emotions flooding through your mind simultaneously. But we succeeded. The portal was transformed from a random generator of parasitic entities into a controlled gateway that operated according to strict spiritual protocols. Beneficial entities could request permission to visit our world for specific purposes, while human guardians could travel to other dimensions to resolve problems that couldn't be handled from the physical realm alone. The casino itself became subtly different after the ritual. Visitors still gambled and pursued material pleasures, but the desperate edge that had characterized the resort's atmosphere was replaced by something more balanced and healthy. People won and lost money, but they weren't driven to self-destructive extremes by supernatural entities feeding on their vulnerabilities. More importantly, the transformed portal became a valuable resource for guardian work across the region. We could use it to consult with entities who had centuries of experience with specific types of supernatural problems. We could travel to other dimensions to track down the sources of invasive entities, rather than just dealing with their manifestations in our world. And we could coordinate more effectively with guardian networks in other parts of the country, sharing information and resources through the portal's communication capabilities. The Las Vegas success led to invitations to work on similar projects in other major cities. Over the following year, I participated in operations that established or improved supernatural monitoring systems in San Francisco, Denver, and Phoenix. Each project taught me more about the true scope of the Guardian Network and the kinds of threats we were collectively working to prevent. But the most important lesson I learned was about the nature of choice and transformation. Marcus Webb had been offered the same opportunities I'd been given, the chance to use supernatural abilities for protection rather than exploitation. He'd chosen power over service, consumption over creation, and had become something monstrous as a result. I'd been offered similar temptations, particularly during my binding with his entity and my initiation into the inner guardian circle. The supernatural world offered incredible power to those willing to pay the price for it. But I'd chosen purpose over power, service over self-interest, and had found something more valuable than any ability or advantage: a life that genuinely mattered. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that we all have the power to choose who we become, regardless of what supernatural or ordinary challenges we face in life. Today, 3 years after that first encounter with the keepers in my basement, I continue working as a guardian. My psychic sensitivity has stabilized at a level that allows me to help people with a wide range of supernatural problems without being overwhelmed by constant spiritual input. I've helped establish a training program for young people who inherit psychic abilities so they can learn to use their gifts constructively instead of being terrorized or corrupted by them. Tyler, the boy whose inherited obligation I took on, is now 18 and has chosen to begin guardian training himself. Not because he feels obligated, but because he's seen how the work can make a real difference in people's lives. He's developed into a remarkably talented medium and shows particular skill in helping spirits resolve their unfinished business so they can move on peacefully. Jennifer has become one of the most effective spirit mediators on the West Coast, and she's trained a dozen other people to carry on similar work in their own communities. The Morrison family's daughter, now in college, is studying psychology with a focus on helping people who've experienced supernatural trauma integrate their experiences in healthy ways. Dr. Chen has expanded her academic research to include collaboration with guardian networks around the world, documenting the universal human need for protection from supernatural threats and the various cultural approaches different societies have developed to meet that need. And my grandfather continues his work as a transcended guardian, now serving as a coordinator between multiple regional networks and helping to prevent supernatural crises before they develop into major threats. The basement where this all began has been permanently sealed and sanctified, transformed from a site of supernatural danger into a protective anchor point that helps stabilize the spiritual atmosphere throughout Salem. Sometimes I visit it to meditate and remember how my life changed when I made the choice to face the unknown, rather than flee from it. The entity that had been Marcus Webb has never returned, though I occasionally sense traces of similar corrupted spirits in other locations. The Guardian Network remains vigilant for signs of humans who've gained supernatural power and chosen to use it destructively. When we find them, we offer them the same choice Marcus was given: transformation through service rather than consumption. Some accept, and some refuse. Those who refuse face the same fate Marcus did: banishment to the spaces between dimensions where their corruption can't spread to others. But for every corrupted entity we have to banish, we help dozens of people discover constructive ways to use their supernatural gifts. The world is full of individuals with psychic sensitivity, mediumistic abilities, or inherited spiritual obligations who just need guidance and support to become forces for protection rather than sources of chaos. That's the real lesson I learned from my encounter with the ancient entities in my basement. The supernatural world isn't inherently good or evil, it's simply powerful. How that power manifests in our reality depends entirely on the choices made by the humans who interact with it. We can choose fear, selfishness, and exploitation and become monsters like Marcus did. Or we can choose courage, service, and protection and become guardians who make the world safer for everyone. The choice is always ours to make. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe for more true supernatural encounters and Guardian Network cases. And remember, if you ever find yourself facing something supernatural and frightening, you're not alone. There are people like me working to protect you from forces you may never even know existed. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future paranormal content. And let me know in the comments if you have any supernatural experiences you'd like me to investigate or explain. The Guardian Network is always here to help. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember that the real monsters are the ones we choose to become, not the ones we're forced to face.